when you, as someone who's active and is able to be at the national level and represent BC, when you're able to talk to some of those women who are the pioneers, I mean, what is that like for you?
It was crazy. It's just so interesting to hear their stories and what they had to go through. We were so fortunate, here in at BC to have the resources and people here to support us, in and out every single day, and they just didn't have that. They were simply fighting to just get instated as a team. So, they were just so happy to come and see us, and it was so cool to just sit and talk with them and see their letters to, instate their team and stuff like that, and we wouldn't be here without them. So it was a huge honor to meet them.
Hello, women's ice hockey fans. This is Erica Ayala bringing you another episode of the Founding Four podcast. I am recording live from the XL Center in Hartford, Connecticut, as USA Hockey has a Team Blue versus Team White scrimmage going on. So you'll hear the sounds of hockey being played in the background, a little ambient noise, some nice hockey sounds for you. I am here, of course, prior to the rivalry series that will be happening December 14th at the XL Center, USA Hockey versus Hockey Canada. And this is a special bonus episode of the Founding Four podcast. As you may know, over at the Founding Four, we are an NWHL-centric women's ice hockey podcast. So I cover on the traditional regular episodes of the podcast, the 5 teams in the NWHL, that being the National Women's Hockey League. But every once in a while, I want to make sure we're also covering other aspects of women's hockey, and that's what we'll use the bonus episodes for. Thought about starting a new podcast under a new name, but that would be a new logo and all of that stuff. And also, thanks to the patrons, my Patreon community, my Patreon posse, as I like to say, we had a little discussion over on Patreon, and we all felt that there's room to cover women's hockey here at the Founding Four. So that's exactly what I'm doing. So I was able to, just a few moments ago, interview Doxie McCoy. If you are a reader of the 9 newsletter, you have heard me wax poetic about Doxie McCoy and about women of color in ice hockey. Doxie McCoy was the first African-American to play on the Boston College women's ice hockey team. She was one of the goaltenders, no less. She was recruited because she played field hockey at Boston College. And as that team was building up, they were at a club to start. And of course, now we know the BC Eagles are a varsity team, a very good varsity team at that. But she was one of the pioneers of the BC Eagles. And I was able to speak to her about her interest in communications. And in the 9 newsletter, I wrote about Doxie McCoy, and I linked to some of the writing that she did. And she would write for the newspaper and really try to promote African-American cultural groups. And she also talked about, at the time, all of the things that were happening as far as race relations in Boston, and that she would be at protests. And she was actively involved in a lot of the race conversations happening at the time. This is the 70s. And it was great talking to Doxie McCoy. The Patreon posse has already listened to this interview. They got the raw edit here, and I posted that. But now I want to post this for everyone at the Founding Four. But I want to take this opportunity before we head over to the interview to remind everyone that Patreon is how I'm able to keep this podcast going, whether it's the traditional episodes or the bonus episodes. They are housed on Transistor FM now that we're independent, and the way I'm able to pay for that monthly maintenance fee is through the Patreon subscription. So please consider, for the slice of a New York style pizza a month, you can help me cover women's ice hockey and lots of other sports. And that's how I'm able to do these interviews like the one you're about to hear with Doxie McCoy. And if you're not able to either this month or at this time, I also hope that you would like, share, and subscribe to the Founding Four podcast. The more eyes, well, I guess ears in this case, the more ears we get, the more likes that we get, the more people that we get listening to the Founding Four, the more we're committing to and we're contributing to the coverage of women's sports, in this case, women's ice hockey. All right, so now with all of the housekeeping out of the way, I want to bring you my interview with Doxie McCoy, one of the original Boston College Eagles. Excellent. So why don't we start here? You went to Boston College. As I understand, you were a field hockey player, and that's how you were recruited to ice hockey. But why don't we start with what was it about Boston College at the time that seemed like a good fit, and how did you end up there?
Well, I'm born and raised in Washington, D.C., and I did go to all-girls Catholic high school. I went to Ursuline Academy, and I was exposed to sports there, field hockey there, and other sports there. But also at the time, a lot of students from Washington, D.C. were going to college in Boston. And so it just seemed like the thing to do at the time. I had a sister, a year older than me, who was going to Brown University. And so because we were very close, naturally I applied to Boston, applied to Brown, I'm sorry, but I didn't get in. So along with applying to Brown, I also applied to Boston College. I believe I also applied to BU, and I visited BC, and it was a great campus. And I also, in high school, I began to be interested in communications. And so one of the things that I did in high school at Ursuline Academy was to take a kind of a visiting course at a boys' high school called Good Counsel in Communications. And so my interest in communications also drew me to Boston College, because one of the things I could do there was major in communications. So it just seemed like a good place to go to for college. I am not Catholic, although I did go to an all-girls Catholic high school, and Boston College happens to be Catholic.
Right.
But I mean that was not one of the things that drew me to it. It was just the whole educational reputation that it had.
Yeah, for sure. And I think still has that reputation in communications for sure. And so with that, was playing sports at Boston College or in college period on your radar?
Well, on my radar, just because I had been somewhat of an athlete in high school, field hockey, varsity field hockey, varsity volleyball, and junior varsity basketball. Wasn't that great at basketball, but I, I, I guess when I got there, I must have searched out the fact that they had good teams at Boston College, and I just was always a fan of sports. So when I went to Boston College, it was a natural for me to try to attach to any varsity teams that were there.
For sure. And I want to go back to something that you said that I think some may find interesting, and that is that, people from the D.C. area were making their way up to Boston. But I think that Boston, and it's become somewhat of a topic of conversation in sports recently, has a reputation. Oh, there goes the period. Sorry about that. Boston has somewhat of a reputation for not necessarily being the most progressive when it comes to race relations. And I'm curious if you were aware of any reputation that Boston had at that time with regarding to being, a black woman, a young woman going up to New England at the time.
But you're right, and that is kind of an irony, because I know that the time that I was at Boston College was around the time there was school busing, and all over the news that there were people who were adamantly opposed to busing, and there were even incidents where people threw rocks at the school buses. And I know that I must have been aware of that before I went, but I think because the way I was raised, my parents taught me and my sisters just to go after what we wanted to do and not to be turned back by whether it be racism or any kind of roadblocks that were in our path. And because I went to a predominantly white high school, I think that I did not have any particular fear in going into a place like Boston, which did have a reputation as being not too kind to black folks. And you did hear about places like South Boston, where while I was there, we knew that we should not go there because it was one of those hotbeds of racism.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of that sentiment. I grew up playing sports. I identify as a Black Latina, and I played baseball and softball. And similarly, you don't have necessarily a lot of girls and women in the sport that are women of color. And it can be sometimes one of those things where, as you said, it's not necessarily a demographic that you're unfamiliar with. But I do wonder if that ever, if to what extent there was a consciousness, particularly in the sports realm, of you being, especially on the ice hockey team as it was developing, the only black woman and the first black woman of just a handful, even as we get ready to head into 2020, that have played at Boston College and played ice hockey at Boston College.
Well, I think that it was so long ago, but I do not recall that I was. I don't recall any kind of particular racism being subjected to that among my team players. Or even any of the opposing team players. Now I know that during the time I was in school, there were plenty of protests on college campuses across the country, as well as in New England, because the African American populations of the students was not really up to par. And so there were protests all over campuses, including Boston College, to try to get the administrations to bring on more students. And I did participate in many of those protests. But somehow, maybe the whole sports scenario, I'm sure it was in the back of my mind, because I came from a predominantly majority black city. But again, my parents always just taught us not to dwell on any kind of racism or things like that, and to just go for what we wanted to go for. And to there were many scenarios when I was growing up where I was the only African American. And so I think just to go to play ice hockey, or to go to Boston College, where the population of African Americans was not as much as it could have been, was not. I didn't see it as a roadblock for me.
Yeah. That's again, I think very, very familiar to a lot of people who just go out there and play the sport, but there's always a consciousness, and it does seem as though, especially with your connection to communications, that you did find a way to vocalize some of the things that were happening in this new community that you found yourself in. And I want to get back to that, but before we move on from the sports, I am interested in learning, how much ice hockey experience did you have before being recruited to this very new women's club team that was started by a fellow student?
I had absolutely no ice hockey experience. I did not. I don't even remember whether I had ever been skating, but I did have the field hockey experience. And I, I, I think that when I was in high school, my older sister played field hockey, and she was a star on the field hockey team. And so, naturally, I was drawn to field hockey too. And I think that I became a goaltender. I think they made me a goaltender because I was not really fast. So I was not fast to run up and down the field. And so, I think because my sister was on the team and she was a star, and, they knew that I could probably be good at some position, they made me a goaltender. And so when I went to Boston College and sought out being on the field hockey team there, the varsity field hockey team, and was pretty good at it. And so while playing field hockey, and it was the time when they were starting the women's ice hockey team, and so it came to be that I was recruited kind of while I was playing. I was there in the net and playing field hockey, and the gentleman Snooks Kelly, who was a legend at BC ice hockey, came up and asked me if I wanted to play. And I said, well, I do not know how to skate, but he said they would teach me. And sure enough, I got my own coach, and I learned to skate, and I did pretty well at it.
Wow.
Especially for someone who did not know how to skate at all.
Wow, how exciting. That sounds like an amazing experience just overall to be able to have that thrill of learning something new and facing the challenges that brings. But of course, the excitement when you do see yourself progressing.
Right.
But I'm curious, and I think some of this came out in the article that there are times when one serves as a pioneer, perhaps without really realizing that, or maybe even realizing the impact. And it sounds as though with this article, but then also with a celebration, and forgive me, I'm not sure if you were up in Boston last weekend, I believe it was, that they honored that first club team. But there has been time to reflect. And I'm curious, as you reflect over the years about your time, whether it be as, again, an African-American woman and goalie at that. I didn't realize you were a goalie. That's amazing. Or just, again, looking at that Boston College team that's been able to really make waves in the NCAA system. What are some of the things that you make of your time as one of the first women's ice hockey BC Eagles?
Well, in reading that article, it was enlightening, and it was heartwarming because I really did not realize that some of the players thought of me the way that they did, reading some of their comments. And, I knew I was different because I was an African American on the ice. And there were times when, for example, when there was an article that was written in the Boston Globe, and I was interviewed in the Globe. And also, I remember one of the TV stations came to do a story on one of the games. I think it was the game between Boston College and BU, and they interviewed me specifically, as an African American player. And I really didn't see myself as a pioneer. I mean, again, I knew I was different. I knew I was, the only one out there, but I didn't. I'm feeling kind of humble, I guess, or with pride, the fact that some of the things that were said about me in the article, and one of the coaches, later an email to me personally, just talked about how, I played a big role in the progression of the team. The fact that he said that He told me that I think our record was 9-7-1, and he said that I was the stopper, and that he felt like they would not have done as well as they did without me as the goaltender. And that really, it almost was brought to tears as I was reading that article because of some of the things that were said about me.
Wow, that's amazing. That is amazing. And, let's flash forward to today now. You are back in the DC area, you're back home. And, DC, I think they've had a pretty okay time as far as professional hockey in the past few years. Do you keep up with the sport at all at any level?
Um, I keep up with it to some degree, especially when the Capitals were in the playoffs, and there was definitely Capital hysteria all across the city, and so I followed them mostly during the playoffs and during the Stanley Cup finals. I've been to a couple of games. I haven't been to one recently, but I do read the sports pages periodically to see how the Capitals are doing, and of course I followed all the celebrations of when they won the Stanley Cup. I did. And I talk about every opportunity that I get. I do talk about my hockey playing. I went to uh, I'm a member of the National Association of Black Journalists, and I went to the conference was in August, and during the conference, the National Hockey League had sponsored one of the forums for the attendees, and it was on diversity in hockey, and I actually spoke up, during the comment period and talked about my ice hockey days, and so I'm proud of it. Every chance I get the opportunity to talk about it, I do. And from that, I was invited to it was a movie screening of the documentary on Willie O'Ree.
Mm-hmm.
I happened to be going to Martha's Vineyard that next week after the conference, and so there was a woman who you familiar with Bill Douglas?
Yes, ma'am, I am. And his
Okay,
wife, yes, Corrine
right,
Douglas.
right. Well, I met her at that forum, and she told me about the Black Girls Hockey Club. And I have not been able to, go to any games or anything with them, but I plan to check them out. And I even sent them the article about, the BC women's hockey. And also, I was just on, there's a local sports show uh, that I was invited to be on because, folks, when I, put something on about me playing hockey on my Facebook page or put it on Twitter, folks are just, really surprised and marvel at the fact that I played ice hockey. So, so I talk about it, and the fact that the Capitals have been doing good over the last couple of years has given me an opportunity to relive those hockey days.
I love that. I was going to ask you about Black Girl Hockey Club, so I'm glad you brought it up. But I'll leave you with this thought. I think hearing you talk about your time and talk about hockey and talk about race in hockey, it sounds very familiar to or similar to what I hear other women of color who play hockey, in that they are aware, of course, of their culture and what they bring as far as who they are to a predominantly white sport. But it's not necessarily something that comes up. A lot of them never felt that they experienced any direct racism from their teammates, maybe a microaggression here or there. Sometimes their family, unfortunately, had to endure things in the stands with other parents or, just fans watching the game. But there is a part of me that wonders if this kind of unspoken and maybe not acknowledging the diversity that is in hockey on the women's side also maybe stunts the capability for there to be growth in the game overall. I think when you look at women's sports, generally speaking, they tend to open up the game to more diversity, whether that be sexual orientation, religion, culture, etc. But we don't often talk about, again, women of color, black women in hockey. as we see the NHL start to grapple with some of these things, do you think there is room to maybe open up and have conversations? We just got another goal. Sorry about that. But to talk a little bit more, overtly and explicitly about all the opportunities and the richness that women of color bring to the sport.
I missed the last part of what you said. You said
sure. No problem. Just I'm looking to see if you think there are maybe untapped opportunities as far as, yes, not necessarily wanting to make players of color feel that they always have to talk about the fact that they are women of color playing ice hockey. But are there opportunities maybe to open up and expand the game by showcasing that, yes, women of color are playing this sport and in your case have always played the sport?
Right. I think that would be something good to do, because, I mean, after all, sports is all about discipline. It's all about teamwork, and there are opportunities. There should be opportunities for young women to use sports as a vehicle to use discipline and build teamwork, not just when they're playing sports, but in life. And so I think it is incumbent upon people like me and people like you and those who are I know there's a black woman now, I think, who's the head of diversity for NHL, and I think she was at that forum that I was at
Kim Davis. Yep.
Right. And so, yes, it is. I am pleased that the NHL does see the need that the women of color should be elevated. Anyone who has been participating should be elevated so that there can be young women who will be interested in the not just ice hockey, but just in sports in general that aren't necessarily young black women are attracted to.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. Well, I said I'd keep you for about 15 or so minutes, so we've gone past that, and I will keep to my word. But I do hope that we have a chance to meet up, whether through Black Girl Hockey Club or something else, because again, I enjoy these stories, and my hope is that I can share them, and that we, not just every February, or not when there's a big anniversary, but that we're able to talk about, just as you said, women of color that have been pioneers and continue to be prominent figures, or just who enjoy the sport, period, that we're here. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I always say to people, that how exciting ice hockey is. Folks in DC who are, of course, football is big. Well, not really now, but but I always say to folks that ice hockey is really exciting, and they should look at it as a game. And I did find you on Twitter, and I did look at your newsletter, so I'll be sure to keep track of it.
You just heard my interview with Doxie McCoy. As you'll hear, I did that interview here at the XL Center. You always got to double dip. That's what I got to do here. But it was great talking to Doxie. She also mentioned, without solicitation, the Black Girl Hockey Club. The Black Girl Hockey Club is an amazing organization that I'm lucky enough to work closely with. And it's all about getting women of color, but women in particular, to ice hockey events. They've partnered with the NHL. They've come to the NWHL All-Star game last year. That was in Nashville. That was a double dip. They also got to see a Predators game. And they have lots of other events. I'm going to be at the Pittsburgh event working with Black Girl Hockey Club. That's at the end of January. There's an event coming up in I believe it's in February, for an outing to see the New Jersey Devils, so that's right up my alley. Okay, so again, I'm going to sign off here from the XL Center as USA Hockey. It's Team Blue versus Team White. Team Blue is they're kind of doing the thing. They've got a 3-0 lead. Just before I ended my interview with Doxie, they scored Again, I thank you all for your support. I thank you for listening. Special shout out and hug emojis to those who are members of the Patreon posse and for those who have made one-time donations. People like Taylor, like my good man Nate from Buffalo, people like Jen. I cannot overstate how much your support means to me and allows this to continue. But I hope you enjoyed this bonus episode featuring Doxie McCoy, an original pioneering member of the BC women's ice hockey team prior to them becoming a varsity sport. All right, folks, that's all for now. I'll catch you next time. Bye.